Hi, I'm Matt Bogenschutz from Virginia Commonwealth University, and I have the pleasure of talking with you today about social inclusion and belongingness for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Generally speaking, we think of social inclusion as having two main elements. First, we talk about community participation, how a person goes into their community and experiences their community. Second, we talk about relationships. So the friendships and family relationships that drive a person's life. When you put these two things together, we hope that they'll result in belongingness. And belongingness is ultimately what we're aiming for as a result of social inclusion. We also think about social inclusion in multiple contexts. So we think that personal factors, interpersonal factors, the relationships between people, community factors, and societal factors like policy, media, and culture all play a role in helping us understand what can help to promote or what hinders social inclusion and belongingness for people with IDD. Despite the fact that we know a little bit about what social inclusion means, we still don't have a way to measure social inclusion. And that means social inclusion looks different in different studies. This is really hard for us as researchers. In terms of community participation, we oftentimes see that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities get into the community less than people without disabilities. And oftentimes, the way in which people go into the community might be as a group and may not be entirely by their own choice. We also know that there have been some experiments that have helped to improve community participation, especially in faith communities and in structured community events like community sports or unified sports. But these have been sometimes short, sometimes hard to sustain or continue over time, and sometimes they've been really hard to scale up. They've been small and hard to bring to more people. So that's been a real challenge. We also know that peer-to-peer support for people with disabilities to engage in their communities can be successful, but again, it can be very hard to sustain and hard to scale up. And those are big challenges. In terms of relationships, we know that people with and without intellectual and developmental disabilities have similar desires for friendship, love, and sex. Despite this, there's been plenty of research to suggest that people with disabilities have smaller social networks and spend a lot of their time in solitary solo activities. And this ultimately results in a lot of people with disabilities expressing loneliness. And we know that these feelings have worsened during the COVID pandemic. All of that research that I just told you about has been primarily with white participants. We know almost nothing about social inclusion and belongingness for people with disabilities from underrepresented cultural, ethnic, racial, and linguistic groups. And that's a big problem. We want to do a lot better about this. And so much of this presentation is about how we can do better to understand the perspectives of a wider variety of people with disabilities when it comes to social inclusion and belonging. So with that background in place, we can talk about what our current debates are and where our current needs are to understand more about social inclusion and belongingness. The disability field is beginning to move to a notion of belongingness. Belongingness has to do with a deeper sense of oneness between a person with a disability and their chosen communities. We really aim for this deep sense of connection, which goes beyond simple community presence and superficial relationships to a deep oneness. That's ultimately what we're aiming for. Another debate that we're having is that during the COVID pandemic, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been deeply affected. We don't exactly know what the effects have been on social inclusion and belongingness, but we do know that for many people with disabilities, and probably especially for folks from underrepresented racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups, that social inclusion has taken a hard hit during the pandemic. People have been out less. People have been less likely to be out with friends and family. And sometimes that's been due to policies or rules. Those rules were set in place to protect people, but ultimately we want to know how people are doing after the pandemic and how we can support people as they emerge from COVID. In our field, we're also coming to the realization that social inclusion and belongingness do not and should not look the same for everyone. It's very personal how we want to be included in our communities and the extent to which that inclusion is good for us. So we want to come to a much better understanding of how individual choice and our own social positions and how multiple marginalizations may influence a person's choices and opportunities to be involved in their communities. We also know that we are interacting differently than we ever have before. Social media and online spaces are now driving much of our relationship building and our social interactions. All of us are living more online than we ever have before, but the IDD research space has only just begun to start thinking about how people with IDD reach some sort of social inclusion in online spaces. We need to do a lot better with this in order to keep our research relevant. And there is ample opportunity to build understanding, not only generally, but especially for people with IDD from underrepresented racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups, and how online spaces may either promote greater social inclusion and belongingness or may reproduce the marginalizations that are expressed in everyday life in the real world. All of that is to say that social inclusion and belongingness is changing rapidly. We need to understand how underrepresented groups are experiencing social inclusion. We need to understand how COVID has impacted social inclusion for all of us. And for all of us, online spaces are driving much of our interactions nowadays. And that has really shaped our approach to research and needs to in the future. At the State of the Science conference in 2022, the social inclusion strand worked together in order to develop a series of research questions that can guide IDD research for the next several years. So we know this background and we know the context. So where do we need to go next? In our group at the State of the Science conference, we came up with a list of research questions that we think should guide IDD research in the next several years. First, we want to know how and to what extent intersectionality plays a role in social inclusion and belongingness for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, particularly from underrepresented racial, cultural, ethnic, and linguistic groups. This is really important because we do not have any research to date on the experiences of folks with intersecting identities. And we also don't know what their perceptions of social inclusion are. So we are literally starting from the ground up on this topic, and we have a lot to learn. We would also like to know how people with IDD from underrepresented racial, cultural, ethnic, and linguistic groups experience relationships. What are their desires for relationships? And how do their desires seem similar or different from the desires of people around them? We know that expectations about social relationships can vary a lot from one group to another and from one person to another. So we really want to get a more nuanced understanding of how relationships form, what the expectations for relationships are, and how we can support healthy relationship building across cultures and across social contexts. Third, we recognize that communities play a huge part in the social inclusion and belongingness for people with IDD. We don't know very much about what can work to help communities in their quest to be more inclusive in this regard. So we would really like to know more about what we can do to create communities of care that will help to support social inclusion and belongingness for people with intellectual disabilities, and particularly how communities of care may be able to help facilitate belongingness for people with IDD from underrepresented racial, cultural, ethnic, and linguistic groups. Fourth, and very importantly, we want to know about trajectories, aka pathways. We want to know how early experiences in a person's life might be able to help us understand the way in which they experience inclusion later on. This is a huge research question, and it would take many years, perhaps decades, to answer. There are some ways to answer it more quickly, however, perhaps using what we call a panel study, where we have people of different ages talking about inclusion, or a retrospective study, where we have people who are adults talking about their childhood experiences and reflecting on them. Anyway, we really want to know what kind of early experiences can help support better social inclusion and belongingness later in life, and how early childhood and older adulthood are all interrelated. Fifth, we want to know how social inclusion and belongingness for people with IDD, especially from underrepresented racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups, looks in online spaces, and what we as researchers can do in order to support safety and full participation in online communities. This might look any number of ways. So we have a lot of work to do to define individual research questions, but understanding both how inclusion might work in general online spaces and in disability and identity specific spaces may be particularly helpful. Finally, we want to work on engaging people with IDD from underrepresented racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic groups in our research at all levels, all the way from coming up with our research ideas to conducting the research to sharing our research with others. The perspectives of people who are trying to serve are extremely important in defining our work, and we want to make sure that they are engaged in every step of the process.